Welcome back to our next episode for the Christian Scriptures class. Today we want to consider the Judaism at the time of Jesus, both from what the political situation was like in Judea at the time of Jesus and what the religious composition was within Judaism. If you were shocked by the events at the US Capitol on January 6th when the United States Congress was scheduled to certify the electoral votes for Joe Biden to become the president, if that made you feel unsettled and a little bit scared about what's happening to the United States, then you might have a little bit of a feeling what it was like to live at the time of Jesus. In Judea, which it was called at that point at the birth of Jesus, things were much, much worse. There was a lot of political unrest and a lot of religious infighting going on at that time. Historically speaking, the Judea where Jesus was born was a client state of the Roman Empire that became that way in 69 BCE under Pompey the Great, or Pompey Magnus, who was the Roman leader at the time, and who then also placed Herod the Great as the king over Judea. There was a certain amount of independence at that point under Herod, who was basically answering to the Roman Empire. But in the year 6 CE, so when Jesus was a child, Herod the Great had died, and there was a infighting going on, at which point it became a full province of the Roman Empire. So think about that for a moment, that politically speaking, it was within Jesus' time actually that the Romans took full control of Judea and the places where he lived. And the Jews did not like that. Also, a little earlier, there were several civil wars going on in Judea among the Jewish people that had to do with who was supposed to be the rightful high priests and who was supposed to be the king. Under the Maccabees, there was a collapse of the kingship and the high priesthood that was not very favorably seen, because in the Torah, that was always supposed to be separate, that they're two different separate things. And so there were civil wars going on about the leadership among the Jews. And that gave rise to those two religious groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who were opposed to each other and who were actually the reason for the second civil war that occurred because of the differences of opinion about the religious leadership in Israel. And so we hear during the time of Jesus that the Pharisees and Sadducees, who both were kind of the spiritual leaders at the time of Jesus, were still fighting with each other and didn't always believe the same things, which Jesus used at one point to pin the two of them against each other when they were trying to attack him. But now I want to show you a part of the video that I produced about 9 months ago when the COVID crisis just began for my Religions of the World class, about the different religious groups in the region at the time of Jesus. Let me just go back for a moment to the Jewish movements that existed before the Jewish War of 66 to 70 CE. From the time after the temple in Jerusalem was rededicated at Hanukkah, you can really identify 4 main movements within Judaism. That's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots, and a subgroup of the Zealots, the Sicarii. We know about these groups from a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. The source comes from Gaius Plinius Secundus, or also Pliny the Elder, who was born around 23 CE. And finally, we have lots of references also in the early New Testament writings, especially in the Gospels. The first groups are the Pharisees. The Pharisees came into being around 150 BCE. Their name comes from the Aramaic parush, which means to separate. For the Pharisees, it was very important to stay pure, ritually pure. And in order to be ritually pure, they made sure to stay away from Gentiles or from sources of ritual impurity or from non-practicing Jews or Jews. Very important parts of keeping the law was to keep kosher with your food, which means that you cannot eat certain animals, and to keep the Sabbath laws. Here is a reading from Leviticus 11 that describes some of the kosher laws. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the people of Israel. From among all the land animals, these are the creatures that you may eat. Any animal that has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed and chews the cud, such you may eat. But among those that chew the cud or divided hoofs, you shall not eat the following: the camel, for even though it chews the cud, it does not have divided hoof, it is unclean for you. The rock badger, for even though it chews the cud, it does not have divided hoofs, it is unclean for you. The hare, for even though it chews the cud, it does not have divided hoofs, it is unclean for you. The pig, for even though it has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed, it does not chew the cud, it is unclean for you." In other words, keeping the food laws was really important, and it's not only about which animals you cannot eat and which ones you cannot eat. Obviously, Jewish people do not eat pork. But it is also not mixing things, like you cannot mix dairy products with meat, for example. That means that a faithful Jewish person cannot eat a cheeseburger because it is a dairy product mixed with beef. It was really important to keep the Sabbath laws, that you do not do any work. The maximum you could do on the Sabbath was to walk 1,000 steps. You were allowed to go from your house to the temple or to the synagogue to worship. That's all you're allowed to do. The Sabbath begins at sundown the night before on Friday evening and ends with sundown on Saturday. In modern Judaism, you still see those things. I don't know if you ever heard of a Sabbath elevator in a hospital. That is an elevator that is programmed to stop on every floor so that a Jewish person who is keeping the Sabbath does not have to push the button, because you're not allowed to push any kind of button. That would be work. You cannot turn on or off light. You cannot turn your stove on or off. That means you might need to prepare your meals before so that they're ready on the Sabbath, and all you need to do is eat. These are just some of the examples of the laws that are kept by the Pharisees, both from the written and the oral Torah. They believed it was not only important to keep to the Torah, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is called the written Torah, but they also believed in the so-called Mishnah, which was a collection of oral traditions that also described the laws. They expected every faithful Jewish person to keep those rules to the best and to the 100% ability. They were the leaders of the Second Temple. Because sacrificing animals was such an important part of it, the Pharisees expected that all faithful Jewish people would be at least close enough to Jerusalem that they could regularly come to the temple to perform their appointed sacrifices. The consequence, of course, is that Jewish people could not live very far from the temple, maybe 2 or 3 days journey, but that would be pretty much the furthest that you could live away from the temple. Jewish people that have moved further away during this period had fallen away from the temple worship and were disregarded by the Pharisees. One thing that the Pharisees did incorporate into their belief system was the idea of an afterlife. The Pharisees believed in some form of resurrection. And this is where the Pharisees were at odds with the Sadducees. The Sadducees were another important group around the temple. There were the aristocrats. They were the leaders, the scribes oftentimes, as they were called. They were highly educated. The high priest oftentimes regarded himself to be a Sadducee. But the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection or a life after death. That's why they are sad, you see. The Sadducees also believed only in the written Torah. They did not accept the Mishnah
the oral transmission. And as they were very educated as scribes, they were also open to Hellenistic or Greek influence. These are the Essenes. They were fewer in numbers than the Pharisees and Sadducees, but still quite known around the time of the Second Temple. The Essenes lived in communities that abdicated any kind of riches. They practiced voluntary poverty. Also, daily immersions were important. They were called the mikvahs. They practiced asceticism, so they didn't eat very much. And the priests were celibate. In modern times, the Essenes became important through the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the town of Qumran, the first ones around 1946 and 1947, and then a few more in 1956. The Dead Sea Scrolls might have been a library by the Essenes and contained many manuscripts of the Hebrew scriptures. And then there were the Zealots. They were more of a political movement. They advocated armed resistance and rebellion against the Romans, and it was probably due to them that the First Jewish War began in 66 CE. A subgroup of the Zealots were the Sicarii. They were people that always wore a dagger underneath their coat to be able to defend themselves against Roman soldiers. During the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, 960 of the Sicarii escaped to the fortress of Masada, where they were 3 years later captured by the Romans, except that the Romans found that each one of them had committed suicide in the Masada in order to avoid slavery among the Romans. With the destruction of the temple in the year 70 CE, all these four groups pretty much came to a crashing end. The only group that survived into the first century CE were the Essenes. Most Jewish people dispersed from that point on into many different places in the world, beginning what is called the diaspora. The destruction of the temple, the main focus of the Pharisees to practice sacrifices and the worship around the temple fell apart, which caused the end of the Pharisaic rule. Life now needed a new center, and that center became the synagogue, a place where Jewish people can gather to read the Torah. Today you still might see a number of Jewish places of worship that call themselves temple, but that does not seem to be quite correct, because the temple is the place where sacrifices take place. And in the modern synagogues, which they really are, that call themselves temple, there are no sacrifices, animal sacrifices. There are gathering places where people gather on the Sabbath or Friday night to read Torah. People dispersed all through the Middle East, through Northern Africa, up into Greece, and eventually into Eastern Europe and Western Europe.
The most grave event, of course, was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The invasion of the capital was nothing against this destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The Jewish people thought always that this was a place that could never be destroyed, really, that should always be protected. And it was the center of Jewish religious life, with sacrificing animals and all of those kinds of things that was very important for the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And having that destroyed by the Romans was a real big blow and caused a huge confusion among Jewish people. It really brought an end to the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Essenes, as we heard, lived on a little bit longer, but the Zealots kind of came to an end, and Judaism, as they knew it at the time, was pretty much over. And that's the climate in which Christianity started to rise and started to have its beginnings. And so Christianity is trying to find its place within this volatile kind of situation. Of course, when Christians started saying that in order to become a Christian you no longer needed to be circumcised, that put the Jesus movement that had originally still been within Judaism That'll put it squarely outside of Judaism, because Jewish people all had to be circumcised. And when the Jesus movement started taking in and allowing to have non-circumcised people to be part of the community, that's when a new religion was founded that was called Christianity. But before we consider more the start of the early church, we will first consider who Jesus was and what we know about him. We will have that in our next lesson.